One of the central and most widely known aspects of Islam is its inclusion of other religious groups within its wider framework. While Islam is seen as the final and only fully legitimate revelation from God, and therefore religious law and religious system, it does recognize that other religions also carry truths, that they were also revealed by God but had gone astray from the original message and intention. Islam sees itself as a final correction that encompasses the truths and messages of all previously revealed religions. And this is the theological background to the so-called dhimmi system in Islam, that there are certain religious groups, particularly the so-called Ahlul Kitab, the people of the book, but also generally, historically, most religious minorities have had the ability to be protected by law and free to practice their religion as long as they pay a tax called the jizya. And people have different opinions about this. Some think this is just a kind of extortion, while others see this as a unusually open attitude towards religious minorities at that time in history, especially as a central part of the religion's theological teachings in itself, so to say. But regardless of one's opinion about that, that has been a central aspect of Islam and Islamic history. And while in practice most non-Muslims who have lived in Islamic lands have been eligible for this protection and paying the jizya, as I said, the group that is guaranteed this treatment in the Qur'an and Islamic law are the so-called Ahlul Kitab, or the people of the book. And this is a category taken directly from the Qur'an and refers to groups that are directly mentioned in that sacred text as religions that were revealed by God previously and thus have a certain level of legitimacy. Well known is the fact that this category includes Christians and Jews, and various other communities have been considered part of this category historically as well. But there's actually a third group that is mentioned alongside Christians and Jews in the Qur'an, but whose identity is a lot more mysterious and confusing. They are called the Ṣābi'ūn, often anglified as the Sabians. They're mentioned in several places in the Qur'an, all in very similar context, and again alongside Christians and Jews as people who, depending on how one interprets the text, are possibly allowed into paradise despite their non-Muslim status. In Surah Al-Baqarah, for example, it says, "Indeed, the believers, Jews, Christians, and Sabians, Ṣābi'ūn, whoever believes in Allah and the last day and does good will have their reward with their Lord, and there will be no fear for them, nor will they grieve." And there are almost identical mentions in Surah Al-Ma'idah and Surah Al-Hajj, and in the latter we also get a mention of the so-called Majus, or the Zoroastrians. But who are these Ṣābi'ūn? I mean, Christians and Jews are pretty clear, right? There lived Jews and Christians in Arabia at the time of the Prophet Muhammad, so it makes sense they would mention them. They interacted with Jews and Christians, and these were widely known religions. Even the Zoroastrians were quite known. But who are the Ṣābi'ūn? Who are the Sabians in this context? This is actually one of the greatest mysteries of the Qur'an, because no one really knows what this word is referring to. It could, of course, be referring to some smaller group that existed in the Hijaz at the time of the Prophet Muhammad, who have since disappeared and memory of them thus waned. But there has in fact been a lot of speculation about the identity of these Sabians from the very earliest periods of Islam, and which have given many different answers. When we read the earliest writings of Muslim scholars who talk about the Sabians or mention the Sabians from the 8th century, maybe even the late 7th century, but mostly the 8th century, it becomes clear that no one really knows for sure, right? Even in the Qur'an tafsirs, the earliest commentaries on the Qur'an, again, this is clear that this is a kind of mystery even to them. And thus, in these writings by the early Muslim scholars, we get many different and varied answers and theories perhaps on who they think the Ṣābi'ūn actually are. And because of this ambiguity, where the original meaning of the Qur'an had been lost to memory, the term was basically up for grabs. Anyone could, and many did, claim to be the Sabians, and were equally claimed to be Sabians by Muslim scholars as well as by historians today. And in this sea of possibilities, we have many claims and many theories. One claim is that the category refers to the Hunafa, which was a term that was used to refer to certain pre-Islamic monotheistic believers in Arabia, followers of Abraham that were neither Christian nor Jews. Some will even claim that Muhammad was one such Hanif, right? A monotheistic believer, a follower of Abraham that was neither that was neither Christian nor Jew. There is another intriguing connection in the fact that there used to be a kingdom in ancient Yemen called the Kingdom of Saba, named after the Queen of Sheba. The people of this kingdom were known as Sabians, and later Christians associated with the region were often also referred to with this name. So this is one possibility that some people have pointed to. Maybe the Ṣābi'ūn refers to the Kingdom of Saba in southern Arabia, that some people came, maybe specifically a kind of Christian group from southern Arabia. One problem with this theory is that etymologically it doesn't really fit, because the Ṣābi'ūn in the Qur'an is spelled with a Sād, so Ṣābi'ūn, whereas Saba'a from the kingdom is spelled with a Sin, so it's a different root, a different letter combination. So this sort of points to this not being the case, maybe. The Manichaeans have also sometimes been brought up as possible contenders, but by far the two most widely considered groups that have been identified with the Quranic Sabians historically, both by Muslims and non-Muslims and even by the communities themselves, are the Mandaeans and the Sabians of Harran. Mandaeism is a fascinating religious tradition that still survives today. Indeed, it is often referred to as the last surviving quote-unquote Gnostic religion in the world. They claim a similar line of sacred history as the Judeo-Christian Islamic stories and place an emphasis on the figure of John the Baptist as an important later prophet and figure for the faith. There's a strong dualistic character to their theology, being Gnostic of course, and ritually there's a huge emphasis on baptism and the power of running water as a kind of purifying force. They of course claim to originally come from Judea, around the Jordan River where John the Baptist was active, but for most of history they have been mostly located and active in southern Iraq or southern Mesopotamia. I've actually made an episode previously on this channel dedicated to the Mandaeans that you can check out, and I hope to also make an updated, more in-depth video on the topic in the future. Of all these connections and different groups that were identified as the Sabians by the Muslims and others, the Mandaeans might have been one of the earliest groups that was officially identified as the Sabians by Muslim scholars. As Sinasi Gunduz shows in a fantastic study on the topic, we can look at the earliest Islamic sources mentioning the Ṣābi'ūn, and we get a variety of different statements that sometimes even seem to be contradictory. Abdullah ibn Abbas seems to have claimed that the Ṣābi'ūn are a sect of Christianity. Mujahid ibn Jarir says that they have no distinctive religion but is, quote, in between Judaism and Zoroastrianism or Magianism. Hassan al-Basri supposedly says that they look like Mandaeans, that is, Zoroastrians, that they worship the angels. Abu Hanifa says that they are between Jews and Christians and that they read the Psalms. It's a whole ocean of different claims, but by the middle of the 8th century, certain features started to be pretty recurring and interesting for our purposes here. The Sabians are recurrently located in Iraq, often in southern Iraq. They are between Judaism and Christianity, or between Judaism and Zoroastrianism, hence perhaps having features associated with both. They believe in the prophets, though not all of them, obviously, according to Islam. They are monotheists and affirm the proclamation there is no God but God, just like the Muslims do. They pray 5 times a day, and they supposedly, quote, worship the angels. Now these are all features that point quite conveniently towards the Mandaeans. They were, as we said, mostly located in Iraq at this time. They are generally monotheistic. They could be argued to have similarities with both Judaism, Christianity, and Zoroastrianism. In the Ginza, the sacred scripture of the Mandaeans, they are told to pray 5 times a day. They do read Psalms, and the idea that they worship the angels is somewhat supported by the fact that angels, the malaika or malika, or good spirits, are an important feature of the religion. So while it isn't stated outright, it seems that by the 8th century, many people seem to be identifying the Mandaeans as the mysterious Ṣābi'ūn of the Qur'an. And this would continue to be a popular attribution throughout history and still is today. It was even more firmly expressed and established in the 10th century in the writings of Ibn Bahlul, a Christian Arab writer. He writes in his Kitab al-Dala'il, quoting another figure called Abu Ali, quote, "A few of them came into my presence in the city of peace, that is Baghdad, in the days of my employment as secretary for Sarah, the daughter of al-Mu'tadid Billah, may God have mercy on him, and my employment as secretary for her mother and for her sister Safiya. I had requested for Sarah's mother as an administrative land grant the site of Bayadir, known as the Jewish in Al-Ghamida, and Adil in As-Saliq, all of whose inhabitants are Sabians. So I investigated their situation and queried them about it thoroughly. I found that they professed the religion of Seth, son of Adam, peace be upon him. They say that he is their prophet. They acknowledge Yahya ibn Zakaria, that is John the Baptist. They have a book that they call the First Psalter, being 120 surahs, short and long. They pray with it. The direction of prayer is Jerusalem. They have books of precept, one of which is attributed to John the Baptist, and another to Seth, son of Adam. They do not believe in the resurrection of the body, but of the spirit, al-arwah. They have the recompense of the garden and the recompense of the fire. As for the chief and his disciples, they enter the temple every day. The common people among them enter it every Sunday, after they have immersed themselves in the water and cleansed themselves." And he goes on, but it's already pretty clear that he's referring to Mandaeans and directly identifying them with the Sabians, who by this time in the 10th century has started being referred to as the Ṣābi'a rather than the Quranic Ṣābi'ūn. But part of what Ibn Bahlul is doing here is to argue that the Mandaeans are the real Ṣābi'a, as opposed to another group that were often called as such too. At the beginning of the section that we just quoted, he says, quote, "Abu Ali, may God have mercy on him, said, 'They are the ones by whose epithet the Harranians are called. They are the ones mentioned in the Qur'an. Their status as dhimmis is sound. There is no relationship between them and the Harranian pagans, nor is there any point of comparison in any aspect of their religious laws. Rather, they are distinct from them in every way.' This other group that he's arguing are not Sabians are referred to here as the Harranians, and they are the second group most commonly identified as the Quranic Sabi'un. Indeed, from the time of the Caliph al-Ma'mun, so around the 830s maybe, they seem to possibly be the most popular theory among Muslim scholars, which is why Ibn Bahlul has to push back against it in this text. Right? He is arguing that these Harranians that many people think are the Sabians are in fact not the Sabians. That's what he's saying here, right? He's saying the Mandaeans probably are the real Sabians. The name Harranian refers to the city that they are from and associated with, Harran in northern Syria, which is part of the modern nation-state of Turkey. This was a place that had been important for the old Babylonian religious tradition, housing a famous temple for the moon god Sin. And it appears that despite the growth of monotheism in late antiquity, both Christianity and Islam, the people of Harran still held fast to their old religious traditions in a way that many other places in the region didn't. There seems to have been a fascinating remnant of Babylonian polytheism, and the Arab writers often refer to them as star worshippers in particular. Some of the most important early scientists and philosophers in the Islamic world were indeed from Harran and belonged to this group, most notably the court physician, mathematician, and astronomer Thabit ibn Qurra. There's also a really fascinating theory that Harran was a kind of hotbed for Neoplatonic and maybe even Hermetic philosophy that had survived after the closing of the Athenian Academy in the 6th century, that the last scholarchs or leaders of the Neoplatonic school there, like Damascus, who had been forced to flee to Persia and then came back to the Roman Empire, that they had actually settled in Harran, and that it is in this city that the Neoplatonic school was actually carried forward and then handed over, so to say, to the Muslims or the Arab writers. Right? This is one very interesting theory, mostly rejected today, I would say, but still very, very fascinating. The Harranians are truly so interesting, right? And this is why I've decided to make a dedicated episode just covering the Harranians, or the Sabians of Harran, sometimes also called, where I will be diving deeper into this particular movement. Really, this video that I'm making now, this episode, is really just an excuse to sort of pave the way for me to make that video about the Harranians. So look forward to that in the hopefully very near future. In any case, the Harranians were also quite early identified as the Sabians or the Ṣābi'ūn, at least from the early 9th century and around the time, as we said, of the Caliph al-Ma'mun. Or rather, perhaps we should say that the Harranians themselves had identified themselves as the Sabians. As we said before, being among the people of the book or the groups mentioned in the Qur'an generally meant that you were seen as a legitimate religion, and that you could practice it without any trouble from the Islamic authorities. So when the term Sabi'un was up for grabs, it was beneficial for groups to claim to be the Sabians, because that would give them legitimacy and freedom. This seems to have been the case for both the Mandaeans and the Harranians. Indeed, there is an interesting, albeit questionable, story about how this came to be. It's a story told by a Christian writer 70 years after the event happened, but it does say that the famous Abbasid Caliph al-Ma'mun was visiting or standing at the gates of the city of Harran. Obviously, the people of the city would have looked and dressed differently from what they were used to, so he asked what religion they belonged to. Now, they weren't Muslims or Christians or Jews or Zoroastrians, but had, as we've seen, a kind of religion of their own, and responded simply by saying, "We are Harranians." And when he asked whether they believed in the prophets or had any scriptures, they gave kind of vague, non-answers. Now, as a response to this, al-Ma'mun said that when he returned to the city next time, after a campaign that he was going to in the Byzantine territories, the Harranians better be Muslims, Christians, or Jews, or he was going to kill them all. Distraught over their situation, it is claimed that the Harranians then turned to a Muslim judge, a qadi or a jurist, and asked what to do. He then told them of the verses in the Qur'an that we have quoted, and told them to just say that they were Sabians, which they then did. And thus they were able to escape the wrath of the caliph. Now, while this is a quite fanciful story, the general picture it paints is probably somewhat true, in the sense that the Harranians probably chose to identify themselves as the Sabians in order to make their situation easier and more comfortable within Islamic law. And it might have actually allowed them to survive for a lot longer than they would have otherwise, because according to our sources, it seems that they were practicing or identifying Harranian Sabians as far into history as the 11th century. The Muslims and Arab writers were often fascinated by the supposed Sabians of Harran, but we unfortunately don't have that many descriptions of the religion other than the wider label of calling them star worshippers. One of the most famous accounts comes from al-Mas'udi, a kind of historian, geographer, and writer who claims to have visited Harran in the 9th century and gives us a very interesting description. Quote, "This community, known as the Harranians and the Sabians, has philosophers. However, there are some of the common riffraff of the philosophers, differing from their elite sages in their doctrines. I consider them philosophers only by way of lineage, not by way of wisdom, because they are Hellenes. Not all of the Hellenes are philosophers, only their sages are the philosophers." Now, important to point out is that when he says Hellenes, that word, in Arabic it's Yunaniya, so when one would say the Hellenes, the Greeks, what that meant essentially was pagans. So that the word Hellene had come to be used in such a way that it basically meant polytheists or pagans. He then says, "I saw on the door knocker of the gathering place of the Sabians in Harran a saying of Plato written in Syriac, of which Malik ibn Uqbun and others of them informed me of the interpretation. It is, he who knows his essence becomes divine. In Arabic, man arafa dhatuhu ta'aluhu. Plato has said, man is a heavenly plant. The indication of it is that he is like an inverted tree. Its roots are toward heaven, and its branches are toward the earth." Obviously, this is one of the main sources used by people who want to argue for Harran as this continuation of the Neoplatonic tradition. Having a quote by Plato seems to be a good indication of that lineage in some way, while others will disagree. But anyway, in any case, the Sabians of Harran continue to be among the most popular identifications for the Sabi'un of the Qur'an, or the Sabia. And when you read literature or source books, it will often refer to this community, the Harranians, as the Sabians of Harran. A very common attribution. Indeed, if there is one group that was maybe most widely accepted as the Sabians in the Middle Ages and perhaps further on, it was probably the Harranians. But don't quote me on that, but that seems to be the most common attribution. I should add, though, that by the 10th century, the term Sabians, or Ṣābi'a, had come to be used in a very wide sense as essentially meaning just pagans too, and it would be used as such for the rest of history. We can see this in, for example, the writings of Maimonides in his Guide for the Perplexed. He talks about the Sabians and very clearly sort of indicates that they are just the pagans more generally. Even in Al-Mas'udi, there is this indication in a part of his writings where he clarifies that the Harranian Sabians are a category that he refers to as Egyptian Sabians, because there's a lineage there to Hermes and so on. Whereas there are Sabians of other regions that are clearly identified as Buddhists, for example, right? So Sabian could also come to mean just any pagan. But the point stands that if there was any particular group that was associated with the term, rather than its broad usage, it would have probably been the Harranians. But does this actually solve our problem? Well, not really. I would argue, and scholars would probably hold the same opinion, that it's quite unlikely that the Quranic Sabi'un is actually referring to the Harranians. It's more likely that they adopted this name themselves for practical reasons later on. Now, I would argue that the attribution of the name to the Mandaeans is a more likely option here, but even that is kind of guesswork. In short, we simply don't know for sure, and possibly will never know exactly what is meant by the Quranic Sabi'un. But there is another option that we haven't brought up, one that is favored by many scholars today, including Kevin van Bladel, and which is based on the etymology of the word itself and its use in the contemporary environment of Muhammad's Arabia. Indeed, scholars like van Bladel and others point to the Arabic word saba'a, which was used at the time of the Prophet in Arabia and meant something like to change or to come out or to return. For example, this verb was used to describe the stars when they come out at night. It could also be used to describe a camel that returned home again, and importantly, for people who changed their religion. So it was said about people who had converted to Islam, or the believers' movement of Muhammad, that they saba'a fulanun, they changed their religion. Indeed, according to hadith reports in places like Bukhari, it is claimed that the Prophet himself was called by his critics in Mecca a Ṣābi', because he had changed his religion from the old polytheistic one to his new monotheism. Quote, Rabi' ibn Ubad said, I saw the Prophet when I was a pagan. He was saying to people, if you want to save yourselves, accept there is no God but Allah. At this moment, I noticed the man behind him saying, he is a Ṣābi'. When I asked somebody who he was, he told me he was Abu Lahab, his uncle. According to Gunduz, there are two ways that this has been understood. Either the Prophet and those who joined him were called Ṣābi', or that they Ṣābi'd, so to say, to anglify it, because there was already a group of independent monotheists that were known as Ṣābi'ūn, and the Prophet and his companions were called this because their new religion resembled that one in some way, that this was the first association that people had to a non-Christian, non-Jewish, monotheistic religion in the region. The 8th century writer Abdurrahman ibn Zayd reports, quote, the polytheist used to say of the Prophet and his companions, these are Sabians, comparing them to them, because the Sabians who live in Jazirat al-Mawsili would say there is no God but God. Or the other option, which is that the term Ṣābi' was used for the Prophet and others simply as a designation of those who had changed their religion. So in other words, if we follow this line of reasoning, it's very possible that when the Qur'an refers to the Ṣābi'ūn, it's simply referring to the followers of Muhammad, perhaps specifically to those who had converted from polytheism, as opposed to the Christians or Jews. Eventually, as the community of believers became more established and unified, the term Ṣābi'ūn would have eventually lost its relevance, since they were all believers and there were no more polytheists left to convert, so that the Muslims would have forgotten the context in which it was used in the Qur'an already by the late 7th and 8th centuries. It's a very intriguing theory and it's quite convincing in my opinion. There are still certain questions left unanswered, and I'm not fully convinced of it that much more than I am of some of the others that we have mentioned, but it does offer some very tantalizing arguments. I think we'll just have to settle on the idea that we don't currently know who the Ṣābi'ūn of the Qur'an actually are. But that doesn't mean that we don't know anything about the different groups that have been identified as the Sabians, because we do know, at least some of them we know quite a lot about, and that is what I want to turn my focus to in the next video. So in my next episode, or one of the next coming videos, as I said, I'm going to be focusing on the Harranians, or the Sabians of Harran in particular. And I also want to make an updated, more in-depth version of the episode on the Mandaeans, both of whom, as we've seen, have been identified with the Sabians. So look forward to those episodes in the near future. For now, I hope this was an interesting dive into the question of the mysterious Ṣābi'ūn in the Qur'an. I'm sorry to say that we don't have any more certain answer than we do, but it's still a very interesting, a very fascinating topic that really lends itself to a lot of interesting speculation and discussion. Thank you so much for watching and listening. I want to remind you that I just released a single with my project Zini called Tasting. It's a new song, rock-oriented, sort of alternative rock with influences and instruments from the Middle East, like oud and duduk and tambur. So if you're interested in that, then check that out. I want to thank all my patrons over on patreon.com who support this channel monetarily, and without whom none of this would be possible. Thank you, as always, from the bottom of my heart. I would appreciate if anyone else wants to become a patron. So I'll leave links to all of this. Everything that I mentioned is in a link in the description, specifically in my link tree. So follow my link tree and you'll find links to everything important. Everything you need to know is there, basically. You can also directly just follow me by checking out my socials on Instagram or TikTok, for example, or check out my other channel, Philip Holm, which is dedicated primarily to music. So that's why I post my music, like the new song, or content about music similar to my content on religion here. So if you're interested in music history, music theory to some degree, and my own music, then go subscribe to that channel. For now, thank you again so much for listening and for watching. I hope you are as excited as I am to dive deeper into the Harranians and other topics in the future. And I'll see you next time.